Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Cryptoeconomics 101, Beyond Tokens. I'm Stephanie Hurder. Happy Pi Day. Anybody celebrates Pi Day? All right. So today, as you can tell, I'm going to be talking about economics and blockchain. So, as I said, my name is Stephanie. I have a PhD in economics, and I work in blockchain. There aren't many people who do what I do, and I sometimes get called a unicorn. And I get asked all the time, why are you working in blockchain? What are you doing here? And there's a couple of answers. So the first is, I think blockchain's really cool, right? I think if blockchain lives up to the potential that it has the opportunity to change how we buy and sell things, how we make decisions, who gets to decide how resources are allocated. And that's really exciting. And the other reason I think it's really cool is that blockchain projects are mini economies written in code, right? And I know as an economist that most economists spend the vast majority of their careers studying one market or one economy, right? They might work at eBay. They might go to the Federal Reserve and think about monetary policy. It's so rare for an economist to get to build economies every day from the ground up. And that's what we get to do when we work in blockchain, right? Some of these economies even have their own currencies. And so as an economist, this is unbelievably exciting, right? But I also know, as an economist, that economic systems need design. Right? You can't just launch a market and send it out into the world without thinking about how it's been designed. And especially for markets in systems like blockchain, where we're trying to give everyone autonomy and choice, and we're trying to decentralize decision-making, the design of these markets is going to be incredibly important if they're going to work. You know, some people say that blockchain is all about giving people freedom. I don't necessarily think it's about freedom, but it's definitely about choice, right? Blockchain projects are all about how do you give people new choices that they didn't have before. And right now, blockchain has a choice problem. So for those of you who are familiar with Ethereum, if you take all of the dApps running on Ethereum as of the beginning of March, they had about 9,000 users a day. Right? People are making choices, and their choices include not using blockchain platforms and then not returning to use them again once they've launched. Right? And if blockchain is ever going to succeed, if it's ever going to reach its potential, we need people to choose to come and use blockchain platforms. And so this is actually where economics is really helpful. So before I went and did my PhD, mostly what I knew about economists was that I thought they all worked for the IMF. And they all wore gray suits. And they all went to countries in Eastern Europe and ruined their economies through austerity, right? But actually, there are other kinds of economists. And specifically, there are microeconomists. And what they do is they study how people make choices, right? So economists, the foundational assumption is that people are going through life making trade-offs when they have resource constraints. Right? So I have a finite amount of money, I have a finite amount of time, and I'm going through the world figuring out how to best use those to maximize my satisfaction. And for those of you who are fans of behavioral economics, this is another form of this, right? Behavioral economics is all about thinking what are patterns in how people make choices. And so this viewpoint really changes how you approach the design of blockchain platforms. Right, so I work with a lot of computer scientists in my job, and most of them think of people as things that can be programmed, right? So they're like, well, I program computers all day, and so I'm going to need some people to do what I want them to do in this system, and so I'm just going to either assume that I can tell them what to do and it's going to be fine, right? Economists come at this from a different lens. So they say, people have free will. They go through life making decisions, right? I mean, if any of you have ever been a boss, you know that it's really impossible to get people to just do what you want because you tell them. Right? And so the economic approach to designing blockchain and all sorts of other platforms is to say, okay, People are going to choose what's in their best interest. So how do we set up our system so that what they choose is also what we want them to do? And I like to think of this, one of my thesis advisors called this economist as engineer. And I think it's really appropriate. It turns out that this approach has actually been really, really successful. So this has been applied to markets all over the world that I'm going to talk about. And I think that this is an approach that we can bring to blockchain to help make the platforms that we're launching more successful. So before I go into the economics, which I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of the talk, I want to get sort of two questions out of the way. So the first one is, all right, you said that my economics and my blockchain platform is wrong. What platform is doing everything right? Right? What is the platform that I go and I copy everything they're doing and I put it in my program and things are going to be fine? Right? Unfortunately, we haven't gotten there yet. Right? So blockchain is still a very new industry. We're still trying to figure out how things are going to work. There is no platform yet that has done everything correctly, at least that I know of. I'd be very, very excited when they launch. The good news is there are actually tools that we can take from other settings and other parts of economics and fruitfully apply them to blockchain. So for example, about 6 months ago, a Stanford professor named Susan Athey and one of her collaborators, Michael Luca, wrote an article about economists working in tech. There are over 150 economists working at Amazon, right? And a team of economists at Yahoo was able to increase the bottom line of the company by almost $1 billion a year simply by changing the reservation price that's used in ad auctions, right? So these techniques are being used all over the place. The second question I get all the time is blockchain going to work? I'm sure a lot of you have very strong opinions on this, right? I don't know if blockchain is going to work. I think very few of us do, right? But I do know that if we're going to maximize the probability that we get something useful out of blockchain and it approaches its potential, we're going to need all hands on deck, right? That includes computer scientists, business strategy, law, psychology, and yes, economics. All right. So now I'm going to spend the rest of the time going line by line through this diagram. I'm kidding. It's OK. I'm not going to do that. This is what we lovingly call our house. So if you ever were to work with us at Prysm Group, this is our framework for sort of the entire design of a blockchain platform. And typically, when we show this to clients, they say, OK, where are the tokens? And you're like, well, the tokens are up there. And they say, well, why aren't the tokens the whole thing? And then by the end of the month, everyone has agreed that tokens are an excellent layer, but you also need the walls and the floor and everything together to make things work. No, I'm not going to talk about the house today. I'm going to talk about what I call the formalities. So these are misconceptions that I see from across the industry. Right? I talk to dozens of blockchain projects, work with many more. And there are certain patterns that I see in the assumptions about the economics that I think are going to impede blockchain's ability to reach its potential. So I want to talk about those today. So the formalities are tokens are magic, forking is freedom, the Lake Wobegon effect, and the borrowed suit. I'll go through each one of these. All right. So the first one, the first malady is called tokens are magic. Right? So when you're designing a blockchain platform, there's a huge number of people that you need to get to work together. Right? You might need miners, you might need nodes, you might need users, you need people to come and buy and sell, you need people to vote. Right? And we see a lot of projects that say, OK, the way I'm going to get all of these people to do what I want them to do is I'm going to issue a native token, and everyone's going to have to buy it. And because they all own the token, they're all going to do what's best for the platform because that will make the token price go up. I'm sure many of you have heard of things like this. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Right, so I want to tell you a story. This is about one of the first articles that I ever wrote when I started Prysm Group. And it's on a concept called a token curated registry. Have any of you guys heard of TCRs? Right, OK, yes. So a token curated registry is basically a decentralized way of making a list, right? So here's an example. I'm from Los Angeles, and up until recently, we had this really famous restaurant critic named Jonathan Gold. So he was the restaurant critic for the LA Times, and every year he came out with his list of the 100 best restaurants in Los Angeles, right? And this was the one source of truth for restaurants in LA, right? If you made it onto this list, you were set. And if you didn't make it, you were really, really sad. So, suppose somebody said, this Jonathan Gold, he has too much power. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But, if he were still here, we'd said, this guy has too much power over the restaurant industry in LA. We're going to replace his list of the best 100 restaurants with a token curated registry, right? It sounds good in theory. Here's where it gets tricky. So if you read a white paper on a TCR or read an example, the argument you get goes something like this. I'm going to make a list of restaurants, and I want people to vote on them. But I want them to be good restaurants. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to issue a native token. I'm going to make everybody buy it. I want the token price to go up. So the token holders are going to vote for good restaurants because this is going to make more people look at the list, which is going to make the token price go up. Yay! This is really confusing. And it's also really unclear to me that this is going to work. Right, so a token curated registry could actually be represented by a game theoretic model. Right, and if you ask me to sit down and derive a game theoretic framework that achieves what a token curated registry wants to achieve, it would be really hard and complicated and take a long time. Maybe I would be able to do it, but it wouldn't look like this. Right, and the reason is that there are all these hidden assumptions in here about what people are going to do. Right? So we're assuming that people who hold tokens are going to vote for good restaurants. And then because there are good restaurants on the list, more people are going to look at it. I mean, for example, for years, the most popular news source on the internet was the British Daily Mail. And I love the Daily Mail, but the top word you would use to classify it is not quality. And then there's the assumption that when more people look at this list, the token price will go up. Right? There may be some circumstance in which this is true, but you would need to prove it to me. Right? I'm not going to go through and just assume that everything here is going to work. So, I wrote this article probably in April of last year. And a few weeks later, I go to Blockchain conference. And I'm standing there. This is one of those blockchain conferences where there's like an art gallery as part of the conference. Right, and so I'm standing there in this room where the light is purple, and there's like a laptop mining Monero, and there's like a Christmas tree around it, and there are lasers, and I'm just like, okay, what's happening? And a guy walks up next to me, and we start talking, and I said, hey, what do you do? And he said, I work for a token curated registry startup. And I was like, really? That's interesting. How are things going? And he looks at me, and he goes, it's actually really terrible. So they were trying to put together a list, think of something like top publication outlets online. And he said, the users, we launched the TCR, and they kicked off the New York Times. And we don't know what to do. We have no recourse. The chickens have taken over the hen house, and there's nothing left that we can do. Right? And so this is just one example where over-relying on tokens as your sort of one design objective can lead to bad outcomes. Right? Tokens are a really useful tool, but they're not magic, right? Just like the US dollar is not magic, right? They're part of a toolbox that we can use to help our systems work well. All right. So the next malady I want to tell you about is called forking is freedom, right? So hopefully I've convinced you so far that it's a bad idea to just assume that people are going to do what you tell them to do, right? Interestingly, the second malady that we see across the industry is the opposite. So it's people giving users unlimited choice, right? So blockchain attracts a certain type of individual who's a rebel, right? People who they're skeptical of authority, they love freedom, they love things that are new and different and sort of, the future is before us. And so there's a tendency for blockchain projects to say, all right, we're building a piece of software, and we're going to put it out into the world, and it's not our business how people use it. It's not our business who uses it. It's not our business who leaves. We just make the software and nothing else is our problem, right? So the title of this, this malady is actually shorthand for, this is sort of a shorthand statement for this general feeling. So if any of you follow the debates about hard forks, how many of you sort of follow hard forks and read about them on a regular basis? So there's this ongoing debate about to what extent, a hard fork is when a blockchain splits because the community can't come to an agreement either about a policy or how the blockchain is going to be governed. And there's a camp in the fork debate that basically says that forking is always good. Forking is freedom, right? And it doesn't, I don't care what you do and you don't care what I do, and unlimited choice is always great, and we're all in our little bubble and we don't affect each other, right? And also, unfortunately, that's not the case. Blockchain, I actually like to say that blockchain is a team sport, right? It's very counter to this. So to take an extreme example, you would not want to be the only person on your own personal blockchain. That would be terrible, right? In order for blockchain to work, there is going to need to be an element of compromise and of working together so that we can get platforms that multiple people can use, right? And in many cases, it's in platform designers' best interest to provide users with tools that they can use to help facilitate coordination with other people, right? And a lot of these are actually economics tools. So just a couple of them. If you're thinking about what do you put on a platform so that people can, buy and sell from each other and trust each other even when they're on opposite sides of the world, what kind of things might you use? You might provide information. You might provide reputation or identity information or pseudonymous reputation. You might provide tools for search, right? You might build a recommendation engine to help people find each other. You might provide structured browsing, all sorts of things. You might provide processes for negotiating prices. So an eBay auction is a process for negotiating a price, right? And finally, you might provide something like dispute resolution services in case two people come to an impasse and can't agree on something, right? And in many cases, tools like this will technically restrict the choices that people are allowed to make, right? If you have identity and reputation in search, you're not necessarily going to be able to do whatever it is you want to do. But these tools can add value to a platform in a way that sort of unlimited freedom and chaos can't. So let me tell you about a couple of examples that I think are particularly good analogies when you're thinking about building blockchain platforms. So the first one is the eBay Dispute Resolution Center. So if you've ever used eBay, you know that if your transaction goes wrong, so suppose I'm buying a teacup from somebody in Boston, and we come to an arrangement, and let's say that that person doesn't get my payment, I don't get the teacup in the mail, I can go to the Dispute Resolution Center and I can say, hey, I didn't get my teacup, help me here. And there's a couple of algorithms, but pretty quickly, you're going to get a real person. Right, a real person from eBay is going to show up, and this person has a tremendous amount of power. Right, so dispute resolution employee in eBay can give refunds, it can throw people off the platform, it can delete reviews, they can do all sorts of things. So when you call in a dispute resolution employee, you're giving up freedom of choice. Right, this person is going to come in and they're going to decide what's going to happen to you and your transaction partner. And so the purists, the freedom-loving folks might say, well, we don't need this, right? If people need this, they can go use something else. Why does my platform have to provide dispute resolution, right? We can just have all our customers can be people who don't need dispute resolution in their lives. And the thing is, eBay is a for-profit company, and this is an extremely expensive service. They provide this for a reason. And the reason is, in order for eBay to be an attractive place for you and I to go and sell our Barbie dolls and teacups and Lennox China, we need lots of other people using the site. And it turns out if you only have the freedom-loving, Wild West-loving people, you have a sales platform that has like 2 FireWire cables on it. Right? The vast majority of users who you need to adopt your platform want dispute resolution. And there was actually a blockchain-based competitor to eBay that launched and said, we don't need dispute resolution. It's, it's counteracting people's freedom. And they very, very quickly learned that this was a terrible idea, and now they have dispute resolution. So this is a good idea. The other convenient piece about sometimes restricting choice, in addition to allowing us to sometimes get along better, is that it can make products easier to use. Right, so a great example of this is the Netflix recommendation engine. So you go onto Netflix, and for example, I've got here, because you've watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, they have all kinds of nice things for me to watch, right? So originally, when Netflix launched, they didn't have this, right? You could go onto Netflix and you could search for things, and if you were a cinephile, this was fantastic. You knew exactly what you wanted to watch, and you could go through things, and it would be great. But for the vast majority of us, the sheer size of the catalog was overwhelming, right? It was almost sort of they had outdone themselves. They had so much material that most people were just like, I can't handle this. And so what Netflix found was that people would give searching on the site 60 to 90 seconds. If they couldn't find something they wanted to watch within 60 to 90 seconds, they would log off the Netflix website, and then they would cancel their subscription. Right, so this is why Netflix commissioned the recommendation challenge. And the point of this, yes, the recommendation engine, which they now use, in a way it restricts choice, right? You log on, it's harder to find random things. The things that the platform wants you to find are right in front of your face. But it turns out people like this a lot. Why? Well, the recommendations that they give to you are based on looking at the choice patterns of other people who are like you. Right? So they basically say, okay, based on what you've done, we think that you're one of these 2,000 types of people. And these other people who are like you made the following decisions. And after they watched Star Trek, they watched, it's not quite The Simpsons, but let's say The Simpsons. And so that's what we're going to recommend to you. So this is basically a shortcut predicting what we think is most likely that you're going to want to watch. And it turns out that people really like this. Netflix estimates that this has saved them something like $1 billion in canceled subscriptions. Right, so, unlimited choice is not necessarily good for product use in this other way. And where does this come up? In blockchain, this comes up a lot. So, I'm a proud owner of a CryptoKitty. Anybody in here own a CryptoKitty? Yes, all CryptoKitties. So there was a cartoon I saw on Twitter a couple weeks ago. I'm happy to give credit. This is not my work. Where it was basically saying that buying a CryptoKitty using MetaMask is really hard. And so it was this word paperclip, and it actually goes up about 3 times as high. And it's all the directions for using MetaMask to buy and Coinbase to buy a CryptoKitty. And at the end, they say, what is gas? And so there continues to be a problem, even with the easiest solutions on blockchain platforms, they're really hard for people to use. And so this radical simplification is something I think that we're still trying to incorporate. That means that we may not give people unlimited choices, but they may actually be a lot happier. All right. So the third malady of the 4 is the Lake Woebegone effect. So I never used to watch Prairie Home Companion or listen to it, but I know that they had this one saying, which is Lake Woebegone is where all the women are strong, all the men are powerful, and all the children are above average. Right? In Lake Woebegone, everybody is special. And so you might say to me, Stephanie, okay, this is great. There are all of these tools that economists have been using to help tech companies, make their products more attractive and to get people to keep using them. They must be everywhere in blockchain. And unfortunately, that's not the case yet. And as I mentioned before, I think part of this is because blockchain is relatively new, right? We're still, as an industry, figuring out what the right technology is going to be, what platforms and protocols are we going to use, so on and so forth. But I also think that part of it is that every blockchain platform founder thinks that their platform is special and unique. And this is something we find all the time as well. Is they're like, we'll go to them and we'll say, look, based on decades of study of humans, this is what we recommend for how people are going to make choices and what this implies for your platform. And they seem to think that instead of having humans, their users are going to be Martians, right? Their users are going to be completely different. They're going to live off sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they will not exhibit the same types of choice behavior as everybody else in the human race. Unfortunately, also, not going to be Martians, right? So because everyone's users are going to be human, there are actually insights that we can use from other areas of economics that can be useful when thinking about designing blockchain. So a question I get all the time is, okay, Stephanie, you're telling me all these tools, but they haven't been used in blockchain. So like, how do even people do this? When you're designing a brand new market that's never been designed before, how do you take all of this theory and evidence and apply it in a way that doesn't, blow up the entire market that you're redesigning? There are actually a lot of really cool examples of places where this has been done. Right, so I want to tell you about one of them, and it's actually from the world of medicine. All right. Anybody here been a medical resident? You have. Did you go through the match? Did you go through the match? No. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about the residency match. So in the US, if you're a fourth-year medical student, you're finishing up medical school, your first job after you graduate is something called residency. And you don't go out and just hunt for it yourself. The way you get your residency assignment is that you apply and you do a bunch of interviews and you talk to people and you figure out what you want. And if you're a resident, you actually make a rank order list of the jobs that you're interested in. So you're like, here's your top choice job, here's your second choice job, here's your third, all the way down. And if you're a hospital, you interview a bunch of job candidates and then you say, okay, I like this person the best, I like this person second, and so on. And everybody sends these lists into a program called the National Residency Matching Program. And they run this centralized algorithm, which spits out job and hospital pairs. And you get, a few weeks later, you get an envelope in the mail that says, congratulations, you've got a job at the Mayo Clinic. You're moving to Minnesota, right? And so this is another interesting example. This sounds really restrictive. When people first hear about this, they're like, oh, isn't it terrible that people don't get to negotiate their own job positions and figure out what they want? There's actually been a bunch of research on this that shows that doctors and medical students actually end up better under this than if they had to figure out what hospital in the nation they were going to move to when they were done with school. So the match has been going on and off since about 1900. Right? So it was introduced and it went through waves where it would fall apart, no one would use it, and then would be introduced again. And in the mid-90s, the residency match had a problem again. It came into crisis. And the reason was another example of free choice. So in this case, medical students were using their free choice and they were getting married to each other. Right? So this was in the ages when the number of men and women in medical school were approaching parity. So medical students would get married and they'd say, okay, I want a job in the same city as my spouse. And the algorithm couldn't handle that. You had to enter as individual people. And so these married couples said, we'll try to do this ourselves. And so once all these married couples started pulling out of the match just became less attractive and started falling apart. So the board of directors of the organization that runs the match in about 1996 calls up a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, then at the University of Pittsburgh, named Al Roth. And Al Roth studied the game theory of these types of systems. And they said, Professor Roth, can you help us fix this thing? Right? And Professor Roth was one of my thesis advisors, and he tells the story. This is one of those cases where you're like, oh boy, why did I pick up the phone? What am I going to do? Because at this point, there had been lots of game theory written about the underlying mechanisms of markets like these. And he had actually written a paper that showed that the algorithm that was used here was equivalent, or functionally equivalent, to something called the Gale-Shapley algorithm, or deferred acceptance, for anybody who's taken operations research. And so that's why they called him up. But his team had never actually gone in and redesigned a market themselves. Right? And so this sounds quite similar to, types of blockchain settings. How do we use economics to design a market that we've thought about, but nobody's actually gone in and redone before? So what did they do? So the first thing they did was they reached for their economic theory. They used all of the game theory that they had been developing over decades. And they used this to form hypotheses, right? And so one of the key things that they drew from all of these years of research was that there was something called stability in an assignment. So if you run an assignment algorithm, the resulting matching is stable, basically if nobody wants to elope, right? There's no job and person who would rather run away together than do what you tell them to do. So they developed this theory and they basically say, okay, Stability is good. We're looking for an algorithm that results in a stable matching. But we're not going to jump from that into redesigning a whole market based on this. So what do we do in between? The next thing they do is they go out and they collect observational evidence. Right? So there were a huge number of medical labor markets around the world that had been using versions of centralized algorithms for a few decades. And because these weren't coordinated in a centralized way, they had all kinds. Right? There were some that worked, there were some that didn't, there were some that were, resulted in stable matchings, there were some that did not. So they went and they collected data and they said, okay, what's the algorithm? Do they result in stable matchings? Is this labor market persisting or does it keep falling apart? And this wasn't perfect data, but it strongly suggested that they were going in the right direction. Right? There was a strong correlation. The next thing they did was they wanted to test causality, so they actually went into a lab and ran lab experiments. So they manipulated this particular dimension of the algorithm that was used, and they said, do we get the results we expect? And that was the case. They did. So they put this together. They designed what's now called the Roth-Parenson algorithm. They send it off, and guess what? It worked. Right? So this algorithm got implemented in 1998. It's still in use now, and versions of this have been implemented in something like 40 different medical labor markets, and also in other settings that I'm going to talk about later. Right? And so you might still say to me, okay, this is really lovely. I'm sure everyone felt good. Why are you telling me about this? And so I would argue this same approach is the one we should be thinking about when we think about economic design for blockchain. And this is not the only example of a design endeavor like this. Right? There's another story that's very similar where a number of economists were called on by the FCC to design spectrum auctions, which are extremely complex auctions. And they had a similar problem where they had all kinds of economic theory and evidence, and no one had ever actually designed a spectrum auction before. And they went through very similar steps. In that case, they got to run some field experiments. But this is sort of the procedure that's worked extremely well when we think about market design. And how do we approach a market that we've never thought about before? Right? And so I think this can really be beneficial as we think about bringing all of these treasure trove of evidence and expertise into blockchain projects. All right. So the fourth and final malady, my favorite, with the one with the most mysterious name, is the borrowed suit. So there are some projects, I think this is something we've seen over the past 6 months at least, where the importance of economics and governance design are really starting to be recognized. Right? It's no longer a good idea to have no governance. It's no longer a good idea to have no identity or reputation. So people are starting to think about, how do I make this work? And what we see happening is that blockchain platform founders will go and they'll see a system that's working somewhere else, and they'll be like, that looks good. I will copy and paste it, and I will put it on my platform here. Right? This looks great. And it could be something that's working in an entirely different setting. It could be the voting mechanism that we use in federal elections. And we'll say, okay, that works there. We're going to put it over here. And to me, this is kind of like borrowing a suit from somebody. So you borrow a suit when you have a problem, which is that you need a suit. Right? And a borrowed suit can work in a pinch. Probably won't fit you that well. Probably the sleeves will be too short and the pants will be too big. And you would never borrow a suit if you were going to someplace really important. Like, you're not going to borrow a suit for your own wedding in most cases. Right? And a lot of these design issues are really, really important for platforms to get right. And so it's worth it to be James Bond in Casino Royale and have the custom-tailored dinner jacket. Right? It's worth it to have the custom-tailored economics that's specific to the setting at hand. So I told you that the algorithm that was successfully used to match residents to jobs had been used in other places. I think the most interesting setting it's been used is actually to assign students to public school slots. So when I was I went to public school, I lived in the suburbs, and I went to the public school down the street from my house, right? And if I didn't like the school that was near me, we could move. I could go to private school, but that was basically my only option. But there are some really big cities, specifically New York and Boston, that have decided that students are going to be assigned to schools. They're going to have a choice of any school in the city. subject to entrance exams and stuff. And we're going to use this type of centralized algorithm to give everyone the opportunity to attend the best schools in the city. And so New York in particular had been trying to figure out, how do we design this algorithm on our own? And in 2003, they call up Professor Roth and his team. And at this point, he's got this enormous team. He's working with researchers from Stanford and MIT and Boston College and Duke. And the New York City School Board said, hey, that algorithm you used over there, do you think it would work for us? Right? And so they take a look at it and they say, actually, yeah, we think it will. We think we can use deferred acceptance to help you assign students to schools. And we think it's going to work better than what you're doing right now. So, okay, the fundamental bones of the structure are the same, but they've got to make some changes, right? So the first thing they have to change is that, at least for high school students, and this was the biggest focus of the algorithm, there are these exam schools in New York, right? STI, Bronx Science. And so they had to figure out, are these going to be part of the same algorithm? Are they going to be part of a different algorithm? If so, how are they going to interact? So it was stuff like that where they sort of had to do housekeeping, where they're like, okay, how are we going to make this work? And there were a bunch of other contextual details, right? Different schools have special rules and all these other kinds of things. But the other interesting thing was that the objective of this match was a little bit different, right? The residency match wanted to be doctor-friendly, but it was also very much a labor market among adults, right? The people going through the match are in their mid-20s. They have lots of advising around them. Whereas in public school matching, there's this overwhelming emphasis on fairness, equality, transparency, and what we would call safety, which is that do families believe that participating in this match is good for them, right? It's one thing for me to tell you, it's another thing for you to actually say, I trust this, right? When we're sitting at the dinner table late at night filling out our form of where we want our kids to go to school, do we believe that we should tell the truth to the algorithm, right? These were the things that were on the top of the mind of particularly New York when they were thinking about this. And so this has changed the design of the match in subtle ways. Another example is a couple of years after New York did this, Boston showed up. And they were like, hey, that looks good. We have our own algorithm that hasn't been working very well. Can you help us? So they implement the same algorithm in Boston. And one of the things that's been very interesting about Boston is that the match has evolved over time to make it easier for people to match to schools near them. It's now easier to go to the same school as your sibling. These are all things that are baked into the algorithm because they're easier for parents, right? And so you see these tweaks, even though it's all deferred acceptance, the way that the market has been designed is changing because of the use, right? And so this also applies a lot in blockchain, this customization. Going back to forking is freedom, right? So one of the questions that's come up a lot is, how do we govern forks? If we have this community that is constantly in threat of splitting in half and half of the people leaving, can we implement a governance process that prevents bad forks, right? So there's some forks that are going to happen and they're actually good, but a lot of them are bad, so how do we prevent them? And so one of the most common approach to governance in thinking about forks so far has been copying and pasting mechanisms from other settings. So people will say, oh, majority rule, that's working, we'll put this here. And it turns out that because forking, so in most of the situations that we live in life, it's actually very difficult for a community to fork, right? So like, I live in California, and everyone said after 2016 that the West Coast was going to secede and join British Columbia. Doesn't happen, right? Here, forking is cheap, and it actually really changes the way that you want to design governance. And so just this one detail can mean that, no, you can't just use majority rule voting. You actually have to think about completely different ways of designing your governance, and we've done some research on this. All right. So I just want to wrap up talking about an analogy I've always thought was just really funny. So one of the founding fathers of modern economics, John Maynard Keynes, had this quote I used to think was just hilarious, is, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid, right? And a lot of the professors who work in market design, which is the field I've been telling you about, they really like this quote. right? Because the tools that they're building are moving towards this vision. What are the type of practical tools that we can use across settings to help make markets and economies work better for people? But I actually think that the analogy can be pushed further, if you will, right? So the first thing is, you only notice a dentist when people don't use them. And you could say the same thing about economists, right? If you launch your blockchain platform and your governance works great and your incentives are aligned and your market design is fantastic, I'm not going to know who you talk to, right? But if your platform launches and the governance fails in a very predictable way, or the market design fails in a very predictable way, I'm going to know you probably should have, you could have benefited from a consultation with one. And I think finally, just the final point is that just like you want to go to a dentist early, you also want to go to an economist early, right? And this is the final piece I'll leave you with. We talk to many projects that are further along, and we go through their economic system, and we say, okay, these pieces look great. These pieces we're not so sure about. You really should revisit them. And the response we'll get is, well, that's nice, but we've already coded it. It's already done. So we're just going to launch it, and we're going to hope it works, right? And we'll sit there and we'll go, oh, boy, that's probably not going to work out, right? So it's better, it's easier and quicker and faster to fix things if you ask people early. So again, summing up, I don't know if blockchain's going to change the world. I think it's cool. I hope it will. I think economics can do a lot to help that. And I just ask you, the next time you're talking to someone about a blockchain project or one that you're thinking of starting yourself, think about how some of these tools could help you. Think about what you need people to decide to do and how some of these approaches and tools could help you make sure they do that. All right. So as I mentioned, I didn't mention, I'm a founding economist with Prysm Group. We do economics and governance for blockchain. And I would love to take some of your questions and comments for the rest of the time. Anybody want to recite some digits of pi? No?
3.14159.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah. 26. So I guess as an engineer, it felt like some of the points you were making kind of missed the point in my viewpoint. So for example, medical residency matching is notoriously actually still terrible if you ask residents, in the sense that, well, I guess there's well-documented problems with doctors and how their wage works and all. The problems with the residency and the fellowship process.
Yeah, they actually got sued for that.
Right.
They got sued for wage compression, yeah.
Or even for NYC schools, right? NYC schools are on a variety of metrics the most segregated schools in the entire country, right? So I guess my point there is it felt like both of those things were opportunities where you could have looked, not you, where people could have looked at the larger problem and come up with the solution, understanding that a lot of the constraints that made that old world were no longer constraints, and maybe make a new world from that. Whereas it feels like what they did was more evolutionary, where they just said, okay, well, let's just take this existing thing, let's make it slightly better to where it works, right? And move on.
No, I get what you're saying, and I think this is one of the reasons, back at the beginning of the talk, I was like, how many people get to make markets from scratch? Right? A lot of the most important systems that we deal with on a daily basis have a tremendous number of entrenched interests. Right? We just had a big teacher strike in LA, and everybody's fighting, and there's a school board election, and so I agree with you. I think that there has been a bunch of empirical work actually checking, like, did the match make people better off? Because, right, some residents just hate it, and it does. Right? It improves the system. I agree with you, and I think that this is, again, one of the really cool things is we can sit down and say from scratch, like, what are we going to do? And so I think it's a good point. Yeah.
So I just want to start off by saying that was a really good talk. Really liked it.
Thank you.
And my question was, you kind of talked about the problems that hard forking creates in keeping communities together and keeping them working together.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate maybe on the structures that you might implement to help avoid forks and help prevent them?
Yeah, so I think, I haven't gone through and sort of classified entirely every governance structure and like ranked them in terms of whether they prevent forks. But I think what we found is sort of communication is a big deal in preventing forking, right? So when a lot of projects think about governance, they tend to think all they need is voting. They're like, okay, we're going to have voting, and everything's going to be fine, right? But it needs to be part of a bigger thing, and you need to have a proposal process, and you need to have communication. And I think this is something, for example, like Tezos has been talking about this. So one easier piece is just thinking about governance as a bigger process as opposed to just one little piece. Yep. Hi.
Hi, I found your talk very enlightening and the structure you provided for me to think about the problems to solve. You glossed over the house model. I believe you thought it would be boring. I would actually find it very exciting. So if you can briefly give an overview, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So this is available on our Medium. We've written a post about this, and this is sort of our tip to tails. Apologies for the quick flashing model. Sorry. There. Okay, so this is the house model. And just very briefly, we're happy to share this. This is, I think, one of the last posts on our Medium. And so basically what it just says is that the bottom layer is the value proposition. And this is typically something that the team already has when when we're working with them is, what's your business strategy? What are you offering? Who are your customers? And then the second layer has actually become less important, but 6 months ago, when everyone wanted to do a minimum token design to do an ICO, you get to the second level, which is how do I raise money to finance my platform development? And the middle three pieces, I think, are where we get into a lot of the economics that I was talking about today. So the three pillars that we think of are contract and transaction design, right? So how do you, when you have two people doing business together, what are the terms that they're agreeing on? What's the dispute resolution system? Is there escrow? Sort of, how do you guarantee that once people have agreed to do business, that you maximize the probability that they have a good experience? And then you step back from that and you say, okay, how about the market design, which is how do you help people find each other so that they can transact? And these are things like search and browsing and auction pricing and procedures for negotiating terms. There's a third pillar, which is information. So this can be reputation, this can be identity. This is what is the information that the platform is going to provide to users to make their experience easier, right? This is setting up a structure that says, we're going to think really hard about what the star rating should be and what it should contain and when you can see it and when you can't, because this is what it's going to help you to do on the platform. Education is also in here. This is something that people really overlook, but a lot of times you need to teach people how your thing works, right? And then on top of that is tokenization and token design, right? So when we think about what does a token do, it needs to support the rest of the design of the platform. So we kind of think of it as going on top, and then the governance is the piece at the end, which helps the platform make decisions to adapt over time. So there's a super long article on this on our website if you're interested in learning more. All right, got about 10 minutes left if anybody has anything. All right, I'll stay around until the hour. Everybody, thank you.